It is 3 in the morning, and you are alone in a house that you know perfectly well. You have lived here for years. You know which stair creaks, which pipe makes that sound when the temperature drops, which corner of the kitchen catches wind in a certain way that produces a noise your rational brain has cataloged and filed under explainable. You know all of this. And then something moves in the hallway. You lie completely still. Your breathing has gone shallow. Every sensory system you possess has redirected its full attention toward that sound, that shadow, that shift in the quality of the darkness outside your bedroom door. Your heart rate has jumped without your permission. Your hands have gone cold. Your brain, which was calmly processing nothing 2 seconds ago, is now running at full capacity, allocating resources with the focused urgency of a system that has detected a potential threat and is not prepared to dismiss it until further information arrives. The rational part of your mind knows it was probably the house settling, or the cat, or the pipe, or any of the dozen mundane explanations that daylight makes obvious. But the rational part is not fully in charge right now. Something older is, something that was running threat detection algorithms in the dark long before rationality arrived as a feature, and that does not take nights off. Now, strip away the house. Strip away the electricity, the locks, the phone on the nightstand that could call for help. Put yourself in the mouth of a cave or under a rock overhang somewhere in Paleolithic Europe 40,000 years ago. The fire has burned low. Outside the shelter, something is moving in the darkness that you cannot identify. And the person who died in this camp 2 weeks ago is still vivid in your memory. Their face, their voice, their absence that has left a shape in the group's daily life that nothing has yet filled. What do you believe in that moment about where they went? This question, whether ancient humans believed in ghosts, is not a trivial curiosity about primitive superstition. It is a window into some of the deepest architecture of the human mind, the evolutionary origins of religious belief, the cognitive systems that make ghost belief not just historically common, but psychologically almost inevitable, and the remarkable continuity of this belief across every culture that has ever left a record. Before examining the evidence, the question itself needs sharpening, because believed in ghosts covers a range of concepts that vary across cultures in ways that matter. The modern Western ghost, a translucent figure in a corridor, the lingering spirit of someone who died violently or with unfinished business, haunting a location and occasionally rattling chains, is a culturally particular form of a much broader universal concept. Across human cultures globally and historically, the belief that something of a person persists after death, that this something retains some form of awareness or agency, and that it can interact with the living world in ways that are consequential, is essentially universal. The specific character of this persistence varies enormously. In some traditions, the dead become ancestors who watch over and protect the living. In others, they become malevolent forces that threaten the living if not properly appeased. In others, they wander between worlds requiring guidance or ritual to move on. In others, they reincarnate into new lives with no persistent identity between lives. The concept ranges from the Greek shades, pale, semi-aware remnants of the living person that dwell in the underworld and can occasionally be communicated with, to the Chinese ancestors requiring regular offerings and attention, to the various forms of haunting spirit found across African, Indigenous American, South and Southeast Asian, and Pacific Island traditions. What is consistent across this enormous variation is the underlying cognitive framework. Death does not simply end the person. Something continues. That something retains some relationship to the living. And the living have obligations, practices, or precautions that manage this relationship appropriately. This consistency is not a coincidence. It reflects something about the cognitive architecture of the human mind that predisposes it toward ghost belief under conditions of normal psychological function. Which means the question is not, why did ancient humans believe in ghosts so much as why would they not have? The cognitive science of ghost belief begins with a set of mental systems that evolved for purposes entirely unrelated to religion, but that, when applied to the specific circumstances of human social life and death, almost inevitably generate ghost-like concepts. The most important of these is what cognitive scientists call the agency detection device. a somewhat dramatic name for the brain's tendency to attribute intentional agency, particularly human-like agency, to ambiguous stimuli in the environment. This system is hyperactive by design. The cost of failing to detect a real agent, missing the predator in the shadows, missing the hostile stranger behind the tree, is potentially lethal. The cost of falsely detecting an agent where none exists, being briefly alarmed by a shadow that turns out to be a branch, is negligible embarrassment. Evolution's solution to this asymmetric cost structure is to err heavily on the side of detection. The human brain is tuned to find agents everywhere, to hear intentionality in random events, to see faces in clouds and shapes in shadows, to attribute purposes to natural phenomena. This produces a brain that is constantly generating potential ghost experiences from the raw material of ambiguous sensory input, and then asking the rational mind to evaluate and override those initial detections. In the dark, with a low fire, with unfamiliar sounds, with the emotional rawness that follows the recent death of a group member, the agency detection device is generating detections faster than rational evaluation can dismiss them. And in a cultural context where everyone around you accepts ghost belief as the correct interpretation of exactly these experiences, rational evaluation has no competing framework to offer. The second relevant cognitive system is what developmental psychologists call the theory of mind, the human capacity to represent other minds, to understand that other people have beliefs, desires, intentions, and experiences distinct from one's own. Theory of mind is the foundation of human social life. Without it, complex cooperation, language, and the intricate navigation of social relationships would be impossible. Theory of mind creates what some cognitive scientists describe as the ghost problem. When someone dies, the mental representation of them that you have built up through your relationship with them does not immediately disappear from your mind. The neural structures encoding your model of that person, their likely reactions, their preferences, what they would say in a given situation, how they would respond to you, persist. And those structures, when activated by memories, by objects associated with the person, by situations where their input would be relevant, generate experiences that feel like the person's continued presence. Grief research with contemporary bereaved people documents this extensively. A large proportion of recently bereaved individuals report experiencing the presence of the deceased, hearing their voice, feeling them nearby, briefly forgetting they have died, and beginning to address them. These experiences are not pathological. They are the predictable output of a social cognition system that was built to model minds and continues doing so after the modeled mind no longer exists. For a person living in a pre-scientific cognitive framework without a neuroscientific explanation for these experiences, the most natural interpretation is straightforward. The person is still here in some form. The ghost belief is not a superstition grafted onto experience. It is the direct, unmediated interpretation of what the experience feels like. The archaeological evidence for ancient ghost belief is more substantial than is widely appreciated, and it reaches back further than many people expect. The earliest compelling evidence comes from burial practices. The Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary relatives, who lived in Europe and Western Asia until roughly 40,000 years ago, appear to have buried their dead. The intentional burial of the deceased, with deliberate placement, and in some cases the inclusion of objects in the grave, implies a set of beliefs about death that goes beyond the purely practical. You do not carefully bury a person, orient their body in a particular direction, and place objects with them because you think nothing of them remains. You do these things because you believe something of them persists, and that what you do with the body matters for that persistence. The Shanidar cave site in Iraq, excavated in the mid-20th century, produced Neanderthal burials that initially appeared to show flower pollen scattered with the bodies, which would have implied ritual flower laying at the graveside, a practice emotionally resonant with modern funerary customs. The flower pollen interpretation has been debated subsequently, with alternative explanations offered. But regardless of the flower question, the deliberate nature of Neanderthal burial has substantial supporting evidence. Intentional burial is a practice that requires a concept of death as a transition rather than simply an ending. Among anatomically modern humans, the archaeological evidence for beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the persistent presence of the dead becomes dramatically richer from around 45,000 years ago onward, coinciding with what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, the period when modern human cognitive and symbolic behavior becomes extensively visible in the archaeological record. Burials from this period include grave goods, tools, ornaments, animal remains that are most coherently interpreted as provisions for the deceased's continued existence after death. You do not give a dead person a necklace to wear because you think they have no further use for it. You give it because you believe they are going somewhere and might need it. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Or because maintaining the relationship with them through gift-giving matters even across death. Red ochre, iron oxide pigment producing a vivid red color, is found in burials across this period and across multiple continents. Red ochre may have been used for body painting in life, and its presence in burials may represent preparation of the body for its continued existence, coloring the dead as one would color the living. The cross-cultural recurrence of this practice, red as a color associated with death, life force, and spiritual significance, suggests a deep connection between the color and concepts of persistent vitality that transcended individual cultures. The written records that begin emerging from the first literate civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China provide direct testimony of ghost beliefs with a clarity that the archaeological record can only imply. Ancient Mesopotamian texts, among the oldest written documents in human history, contain extensive references to ghosts called Atemmu in Sumerian and Akkadian. The Atemmu was understood as a component of the person that persisted after death and required proper burial and ongoing ritual attention from surviving family members. An Atemmu, whose family had failed to provide appropriate burial rites, or whose family line had died out, leaving no one to maintain offerings, became a restless, potentially dangerous presence in the living world. The Mesopotamian ghost feared its own neglect. The logic was social. The obligations of family did not end at death. The living owed the dead their proper rights, and failure to pay this debt had consequences for the living as well as the dead. A neglected Atemmu might cause illness, misfortune, or haunting experiences in those who had failed their obligations. This created a powerful motivation for maintaining funerary practice and ancestor veneration that functioned as a social enforcement mechanism regardless of whether the ghosts were real. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about death and persistence were among the most elaborate and systematically articulated of the ancient world. The Egyptian understanding of the person included multiple components. The bi, which roughly corresponded to personality or individuality, and could move between the living world and the afterlife. The K, which was something like life force or vital essence that persisted after death. The Ak, a transformed and glorified post-death state achieved through proper ritual. And the shadow and name, both of which were considered to carry the person's identity and required protection. Egyptian funerary practice was designed to manage all of these components simultaneously, preserving the body so the BA could return to it, providing food and goods for the Ka's continued needs, performing rituals that transformed the deceased into an Ach, capable of joining the gods, and protecting the name and shadow from harm or erasure. The enormous investment of Egyptian civilization in tomb construction, mummification, and funerary ritual reflects how seriously this belief system was taken and how central the management of the dead was to Egyptian society at every level. The ancient Greeks had a detailed geography of the afterlife, the underworld with its rivers, its judges, its regions for different categories of the dead, and a clear belief in ghosts as the shades of deceased persons that occasionally crossed back into the living world. The Odyssey contains one of the most detailed ancient descriptions of communicating with the dead. Odysseus sacrifices animals at a pit to attract the blood-drinking shades, who regain temporary awareness through consuming blood and can then speak with the living. This ritual, the nekia, or consultation of the dead, reflects a belief system in which contact between the living and dead was dangerous but possible, and in which the dead retained something of their living identities. The psychological drivers of ghost belief intersect with the social functions that ghost beliefs serve in ways that help explain why this belief has been so persistent and so universal. Ghost beliefs enforce social norms across the boundary of death. In many cultures, the dead are understood as watching the living, concerned with whether the living behave in ways the dead would have approved of. Maintaining family honor, fulfilling obligations, treating other people fairly. An ancestor who can see you and who will be displeased, or worse, actively harmful if you behave badly, is a more comprehensive social enforcement mechanism than any institution the living world can construct. The dead are everywhere. They never sleep. They have a stake in how the living behave because the living's behavior reflects on and affects the dead's own status in whatever realm they inhabit. This function is particularly visible in ancestor veneration traditions, which are among the most geographically widespread and historically deep forms of ghost belief. Chinese ancestor veneration, African traditional religions, indigenous Japanese Shinto practice, Hindu ancestor rites. The Roman cult of the Lares and Penates all represent cultures in which the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead was managed through regular ritual, offering, and invocation, and in which the dead retained an active interest in and influence over the affairs of the living. The social cohesion that ancestor veneration produces is substantial and well documented in anthropological literature. When the dead of a lineage are understood as watching, judging, and influencing the living members of that lineage, the lineage has a powerful motivational structure for maintaining its obligations, resolving its internal conflicts, and presenting a united face to the world. The ancestors are always present at every family decision. Their reputation is at stake in every family member's behavior. The dead are, in this framework, the most effective social institution the culture has available. The phenomenology of grief, the actual psychological experience of losing someone close, provides the most direct bridge between the cognitive systems described above and the ghost beliefs documented in ancient cultures. Bereavement hallucinations, as they are termed in contemporary psychological literature, are experiences of sensing the presence of a deceased person in ways that feel perceptually real rather than merely remembered. Hearing the deceased's voice, seeing them briefly in a crowd, feeling their presence in a room, smelling a scent associated with them. These experiences are reported by a substantial proportion of bereaved people. Estimates range from 30 to 80% depending on the study methodology, and they are more common in the period immediately following loss, in contexts associated with the deceased, and in states of emotional intensity. These experiences are not signs of mental illness or pathological grief. They are the predictable output of a brain that has built elaborate models of important people in its social world and that cannot immediately retire those models when the person they modeled dies. The model keeps running. It generates outputs. Those outputs, experienced by someone who does not have a neuroscientific framework for understanding them, feel like the person's presence. For an ancient person in a small, tight-knit group where every member was deeply known to every other member, where no one had a scientific framework for understanding bereavement hallucinations, and where the cultural context provided ghost belief as the ready-made interpretation of these experiences. The conclusion that the dead person was somehow still present would have felt not like superstition but like straightforward perceptual evidence. You heard them. You felt them. You smelled them. The dead are here. The cross-cultural universality of ghost belief is itself data worth examining carefully because it is one of the strongest patterns in the entire anthropological record. Every major culture and civilization for which we have documentary evidence believed in some form of persistence after death and some form of possible interaction between the dead and the living. This universality is not what you would expect if ghost belief were simply a cultural invention that spread from a single origin point. You would expect the same geographic distribution you see with other cultural inventions, concentrated in the region of origin and becoming rarer with increasing distance. Instead, ghost beliefs show up independently in cultures with no historical contact with each other, in identical or near identical forms, in populations separated by oceans and millennia. This pattern of independent convergence is the signature of a belief that is not purely cultural transmission, but rather the predictable output of a cognitive architecture that all humans share. Ghost belief is what the human mind naturally produces when it encounters death, grief, and the experience of continued sensing of absent people without a competing scientific framework for interpreting these experiences. This doesn't resolve the metaphysical question of whether ghosts are real. It says something specific about why humans believe in them, and that why is deeply woven into the evolutionary history of human cognition in a way that makes ghost belief not a failure of rationality, but a natural expression of cognitive systems that serve essential functions. The ancient humans lying awake in their shelters 40,000 years ago, hearing something move in the darkness beyond the fire, thinking about the person who died 2 weeks before and whose absence is still raw, they were not being primitive or superstitious in reaching for ghost belief as their interpretive framework. They were doing what the human mind does. They were running threat detection algorithms tuned to find agents in ambiguous stimuli. They were experiencing the continued activation of mental models of people who no longer existed to update those models. They were interpreting experiences of grief. The voice half heard, the presence half felt, the dream more vivid than waking, through the only cognitive framework available to them. And they were building something in response to these experiences. Burial practices, ancestor veneration, protective rituals, funerary rites, that served real social functions regardless of their metaphysical accuracy. The ghost belief organized their relationship with death, with the dead, and with each other in ways that made their small societies more cohesive and more capable of surviving the losses that death periodically imposed. The house settles. The cat moves in the hallway. Your rational mind reasserts itself and provides the obvious explanation, and you go back to sleep. But for a moment there, in the dark, with your heart rate elevated and your hands cold and all your attention focused on the doorway, you were running the same cognitive software that your ancestors ran in their rock shelters, doing the same thing their minds did with the same inputs, arriving at the same destination. The ghosts have always been there. They live in the architecture of the mind that evolution built, waiting for darkness and the right kind of silence to become real again.